Haverford Township Free Library, and thank you, Haverford Township Historical Society, both great institutions. If you are not a member of the Historical Society, I highly recommend it. It's a great organization and a lot of local history, which I've learned quite a bit from them. So tonight we're going to talk about Abraham Lincoln, slavery, and the Civil War. The hardest thing is trying to condense this to about an hour or so, because I've taught 8 to 10 week courses on this where you can really dive in, but an hour is a good teaser. It's a fascinating subject because, of course, we all know Lincoln as the great emancipator. However, it took him a while to get there. Lincoln was, so for Abraham Lincoln, he was a staunch believer in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And he was also a staunch believer in the Constitution. So, and we'll talk about that in a bit. There are a couple of anniversaries or birthdays that I want to discuss. One of Abraham Lincoln's heroes, Thomas Jefferson, because he wrote the Declaration, his birthday was on the 13th of April, yesterday. Today is the anniversary. It's actually the 160th anniversary of the surrender of Fort Sumter. Behind me is a representation of the flag that flew at Fort Sumter when it was attacked in April of 1861. Appomattox, of course, that occurred, Lee's surrender is April 9th, 1865. Today's the anniversary of Abraham Lincoln actually being assassinated, being shot in Ford's Theater. That happened on April 14th, 1865. Of course, his death is April 15th, 1865. Another reason to dislike April 15th, Tax Day and Lincoln dying. And then last but not least, John Wilkes Booth is captured April 26th of 1865. And I shouldn't say captured, he's killed. He's found and he's killed. So Lincoln himself, as I mentioned, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution played big roles. The other thing for Lincoln is that although he felt that slavery was immoral, my morality is different than your morality. So although we would all agree today that slavery is an immoral thing, back in the 1860s, that wasn't the case, especially in the South. So Lincoln, from early on, said, how can I get people on board with my anti-slavery views? And his thought was, I can't go at it from an abolitionist standpoint, because he thought abolitionists were too progressive, too liberal, too far out of the mainstream. Although he agreed with their ultimate goal that slavery should be, abolished. He thought John Brown went about it wrong. He said, by blowing things up or taking things over, you're not going to change anything. The way that we change and get rid of slavery ultimately is amending the Constitution. Lincoln not initially, but he believed, because he was such a staunch follower of the Constitution and believer in it, he went along with the Fifth Amendment that protects property. Slaves at the time, unfortunately, were not considered citizens. They were considered property. So Lincoln said the only way that we can change this is to amend the Constitution, which of course happens after his death. So Lincoln is also saying, I have to make this an economic argument. And think about it. If you want to have your message have great impact, if you can tie it to economics, Lincoln said, who among us works for free? Why should we not allow men, slaves, to enjoy the fruits of their labor? And his thought was he would gain a greater following that way than saying it's immoral, because again, people's morality is different and it's a harder sell. Much like when we got to the Civil War, Lincoln said the war is about the Union, because if he comes out and says this is about abolishing slavery, he's going to lose half of the Northern population's support. So if he makes it patriotic about the Union, which he thought was perpetual and protected by the Constitution, he thought that was his strongest initial argument. It's not until later in the war, with Great Britain and France considering recognition of the South, that Lincoln says, with the Emancipation Proclamation, this is now about abolishing slavery, because he's thinking a step or two ahead, master politician that he was, saying, if I now say this is about slavery, there's no way on God's green earth that Great Britain is going to say, hey, we're going to recognize the South, because the South wants to not only protect slavery, but extend it. So again, very smart move on his part. If we go back into American history, after the Revolutionary War, you have several Northwest ordinances, 1784, 1785, and 1787. And what each of those ordinances did, they addressed slavery. And they said, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 in particular, saying that the Northwest Territory shall be free of slavery. Now in 1787, the Northwest Territory was Detroit. It wasn't Seattle, it wasn't Portland, it was, Detroit and Wisconsin and those areas. So it starts there. And it's after the war with the Northwest ordinances that the South starts to cast a leery eye on the North. Another reason that the South is upset is that when the Constitution is written and the nation is founded and George Washington is our president, our first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, says, why are we buying our stuff from the British, from the French, from the Dutch, from the Spanish? What we should be doing is manufacturing our own goods. And of course, in the North, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Providence, Pittsburgh, Detroit, on and on and on, the North buys into it and says, you're absolutely right. So you see the promulgation of manufacturing. Philadelphia was a major textile manufacturing center from about 1790 until after World War II. The irony of ironies, where is the cotton coming from to run all of these textile plants in the North? It's coming from the South. So as the North grabs onto manufacturing, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, the South says, why do we need to manufacture? We have cotton, we have slaves. And in 1793, when Eli Whitney invents and then perfects the cotton gin, before the cotton gin, it would take a slave a day to pick a pound of lint from cotton. After the cotton gin, a slave was able to crank out 1,000 pounds a day. If you're a slave owner in the South, are you going to buy into Hamilton's argument or belief that manufacturing should take hold in the South? Absolutely not, because you're making money hand over fist. And where is your investment? It's in your slaves. So it's from this point, from about 1790 moving forward, that the North starts to separate from the South economically. The ripple effects of that are, as manufacturing plants are being set up in the North, when immigrants come to this country, where are they settling? Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. They're not going down south because they are not needed down there. A ripple effect of that, as the population grows in the North, what is the House of Representatives based on? Population. So the northern states have greater representation in the House of Representatives. So the South says, oh my gosh, not only are we being superseded economically, but we're also being superseded politically. And the North has been railing about slavery. Think about it. By about 1810, slavery in the North is all but gone, right? Or there have been laws put through that say, by the time a slave who's a child now, by the time they're 25, they are free, right? But in the South, it is going full bore. The other thing is, as the nation is growing, as we are expanding westward, the balance is trying to be kept between slave and free state. So literally up through 1820, as one state comes in, to tip the balance to either slave or free state, the next state that comes in has to be the opposite, so that the power in the Senate is not exceeded by one region of the country over another. So the Northwest ordinances work until about 1820, when we have the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that is put forward by another of Lincoln's great heroes. I am going to attempt to share my screen and show a picture of Henry Clay. Bear with me, if you will. So that is not Henry Clay, as you can see, but this is Henry Clay. So Henry Clay was a powerful politician from Kentucky, the same state that Lincoln was born. He was a Whig, W-H-I-G. So by the time Clay comes to Congress, you have Democratic Republicans, which are the party of Jefferson, which believe that states should have more power than the federal government. The Federalists, who were made up of Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, they are falling apart. They believe in a more strong, centralized federal government. Well, the Whigs come in as a replacement for the Federalists. The Whigs are anti-slavery. The Whigs also believe, and Clay is a big believer in, internal improvements. While the South is saying the only internal improvements that you're going to make proportionally are in the North, right? With railroads and canals and those sorts of things. So the South, again, looks at Clay almost as a traitor, because technically he's a Southerner. He's also a slave owner. But as the country is growing, in 1819, there's an argument as to how Missouri should enter the Union and how Maine should enter the Union. What happens is that Maine ends up entering as a free state, and Missouri ends up entering as a slave state. One of the big agreements that comes out of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, I might be jogging your memory banks from elementary school or high school, but no slavery above the 3630 line. So when you draw longitude and latitude, slavery above that line. So basically in the Midwest, it was, north of Illinois. And it was a response to the Louisiana Purchase. Of course, the South is saying we can expand slavery in all this territory. And the North is saying absolutely not. So part of the Compromise of 1820 was no slavery above this line. That seems to hold for about 25 years until we enter the Mexican-American War. As a result of the war, Lincoln was anti-Mexican-American War, very loudly. But as a result of the war, we basically get the modern Southwest ceded to us by Mexico, California, New Mexico, Arizona. Texas comes over beforehand, but as all this land is being ceded to us, all this territory, the argument comes back: will they be slave? Will they be free? So you've got California comes in as a free state, and the South goes bananas, and says, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? That leads us to the Missouri Compromise of 1850, which Clay, it's one of his last acts in Congress. He dies in 1852. Clay puts forth an omnibus bill. It's a whole collection of bills that at the time, Congress says there's no way we are going to approve this. So who helps Clay out? This gentleman, Stephen Douglas, says, let's separate these into 5 separate bills. One of the bills calls for a Fugitive Slave Act. So if a Southern slave leaves, runs away and goes to a Northern territory, say Ohio, which is a free territory, the law previously was the slave is now free. Well, as part of the bartering in the Missouri Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act says that slave owner can go to Ohio, find their slave, and bring them back into slavery. Another gentleman who plays a huge role in the Missouri Compromise of 1850 is Daniel Webster. He's a senator from Massachusetts. He's a great orator. He is also not quite on the level of Clay, but a hero of Abraham Lincoln's. And he actually helps to push the Fugitive Slave Act, which, coming from a state where slavery has been abolished, is a stain on his legacy. So Missouri Compromise is put through, and the thought is this will keep us from getting into a civil war. I'm going to bring up, there's one other gentleman. Oh, perfect. It never works out this way. This is John C. Calhoun. John is a senator from South Carolina, big believer in states' rights, big believer in slavery. He does not believe that the federal government has any role in abolishing or stopping the extension of slavery, because in his mind, he feels that that we should, or that the federal government should leave it alone and let it be, if you will. I'm going to stop sharing right now, so you have to stare at me, unfortunately. So what happens is Clay actually, and I forgot to mention this, in 1832, there's what's called the Nullification Crisis. Andrew Jackson is president. His vice president is John C. Calhoun. The federal government puts through a protective tariff, which hurts the South particularly because it's on cotton and other agricultural goods. As the vice president, Calhoun says, we do not have to follow this law. The state of South Carolina, where I'm from, nullifies it because states can nullify federal laws. They absolutely cannot. What happens is Jackson actually is also a hero of Lincoln because he follows the Constitution. He also is a big unionist. So Jackson says, here's your choice, South Carolina. I'm going to lower the tariff and you can pay it, or I'm going to lower the tariff, you don't pay it, and federal troops will be in Charleston tomorrow. Guess what happens? South Carolina says, you know what? That tariff is not such a bad idea. So it's really the closest we came at that time to civil war. And then what happens? Calhoun actually resigns as the vice president. Imagine if that happened today, people's heads would explode. So Lincoln is watching all this. Lincoln is born in 1809. He's serving in the Illinois state legislature. He serves one term in Congress as a representative, and that's it. Lincoln is watching all these things happen. After the Compromise of 1850, you have the Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854. We've all heard of bleeding Kansas. The Nebraska territory applies for statehood. And what happens is the federal government at that time says, you have to have a certain population to be considered a state, and then you have to put through a constitution. Well, what happens is that pro-slavery inhabitants from other states rush into the territory to try and establish it as a slave territory. You have basically a very small scale civil war where the town of Lawrence, Kansas, where the University of Kansas is today, is burned because of the fighting. So Lincoln is watching this and saying, oh my gosh, something has to be done. Last but not least, you have the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court in 1857. So all these things are piling on top of each other. In the Dred Scott case, Dred Scott was a slave, went to free territory in Ohio and Illinois, but the Supreme Court said Dred Scott is still a slave. He's not allowed to bring his suit to court because he is not a citizen of the United States, which sounds crazy to us today. The other thing that Taney, who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, arguably one of the worst of all time because of this decision, what Taney also does, he goes further and says the Missouri Compromise of 1820 is unconstitutional, even though it was signed into law by Congress. So what does that do? It gets rid of the 3630 line, and the South is celebrating, saying, oh my gosh, we can push slavery as far west as the border goes. So all of this is going on as Abraham Lincoln is climbing the political chain. He gives his first major anti-slavery speech in 1854. He gives the House divided speech, right? Which we all, a house divided itself against itself cannot stand, talking about the North and the South. Where he gets that saying is actually from one of Aesop's fables that he memorized as a kid. And it's the fable of the 4 oxen and the lion. And very quickly, a lion is circling 4 oxen, and the oxen are saying to each other, if we band together, the lion cannot beat us. But if we separate one by one by one by one, we're all dead. So, and that's what Lincoln is talking about here. Lincoln wins or runs in 1858 for the Republican nomination to the U.S. Senate. At that time, U.S. senators were picked by state legislatures. Pardon me. He runs against Stephen Douglas. We've all heard of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? 7 debates over 70 days in Illinois, where they are running. Douglas makes himself politically vulnerable by saying that the slavery question cannot be decided by the federal government. It should be decided by what he calls popular sovereignty. And what he's talking about is that local jurisdictions should decide whether or not they are pro-slavery or anti-slavery, whether slavery is allowed in that area or is not allowed in the area. And of course, Lincoln says, you're nuts, you're out of your mind. There's no way it should be this way. Lincoln says, if we go this route, then you're going to have a dozen bleeding Kansases on your hands because pro-slavery and anti-slavery elements are going to rush in and fight each other. John Brown cuts his teeth in bleeding Kansas at Pottawatomie Creek and Osawatomie. Say those both 5 times fast. Brown and his sons are strong anti-slavery advocates. They kill several men in Kansas who are pro-slavery during all of this. Lincoln says that, again, we have to follow the Constitution. If a state wants to join the U.S., they have to follow the Missouri Compromise. They have to follow federal law, or as it's been enacted at this point. The House divided speech is in 1858, June 16th. It is seen as one of the most important speeches in American history. It warned that the crisis over slavery would not be resolved until America was completely slave or completely free. He turns on Lincoln, turns on Douglas by saying that the threat to American unity came from Douglas's popular sovereignty perspective. Douglas says, you're out of your mind. Now, Douglas at this time is a multi-term US senator. He's much more well-known nationally than Lincoln is. His nickname is the Little Giant. So, and he's known, as I said, much better than Lincoln is. Douglas disagrees with Lincoln's claim that the founding fathers opposed slavery, as many of them owned slaves. He said that the power to decide about slavery should be left to each community on the local level. He said that slavery, Douglas, saying slavery would never survive outside of the South for basic geographical, weather reasons, economic reasons. Ultimately, Douglas argued that the issue came down to conflicting ideologies, a view of America as a confederacy of sovereign and equal states against a federalist empire of consolidated states. Lincoln references this in his first inaugural when they talk about secession. Douglas accuses Lincoln of being an abolitionist, which at that time you're seen as basically, kind of out of the mainstream. One thing we forgot to mention, folks, because I was so excited to start talking, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. If you want to go live, we're being recorded. You'll be recorded for posterity. But I will be happy to answer any questions that you have at any time. And you can also save them to the end, whatever you wish. So Douglas beats Lincoln for the Senate seat. The legislature in Illinois votes for him, 54 votes to 46 for Lincoln. What Lincoln does for the next 16 months is he campaigns as a Whig candidate. And now at this point, the Whigs have fallen off and the Republican Party has been founded. One of the founding planks of the Republican Party is the abolition of slavery. Okay, and actually it's to stop the extension of slavery with the ultimate abolition. Lincoln lays the groundwork for his candidacy in 1860. What helps Lincoln is, unlike Douglas, he's an unknown quantity. People don't know him nationally. They've read his speeches, the House Divided speech, his Cooper Union address that he gives in New York City. So that's how people get to know him, but he doesn't have quite the pedigree or the resume or the name recognition that a Douglas has. So Lincoln is able to beat William Seward, is able to beat Salmon Chase, people who are considered much more likely candidates for the 1860 Republican nomination for president. The party platform in 1860 for the Republicans opposes the extension of slavery westward. It denounces John Brown's raid, which takes place in 1859 on Harper's Ferry. It also endorsed a protective tariff, a transcontinental railroad, and a Homestead Act. Republicans offered to bind the nation together as a free labor society on Northern capitalism. So again, going to, are you going to work for free? I don't work for free. Why allow, people to work and not, as Lincoln said, enjoy the fruits of their labor? So that is his big argument here. And that's what he's trying to do. Again, if he goes with morality, he's not going to get the support that he needs. So the election of 1860 positions America on the brink of fundamental change. A Republican win would end the South's political dominance of America. Southerners had been president 2/3 of the time since the country's founding. Think about it. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, on and on and on and on. Polk. No Northern president had been reelected. Who is Lincoln running against in 1860? One of them, the Democratic candidate, is our own beloved James Buchanan from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Arguably one of the worst presidents because he did nothing to stop the onset of the Civil War. By the time of Lincoln's inaugural, I should say after his election, Lincoln wins because the Democrats are actually split into several different parties, if you will. Some are more strident on slavery than others, and it splits the vote, and that's how Lincoln wins. Lincoln is not on any Southern state's ballot. It's the only time in American history that's happened, right? Lincoln wins because the North has a greater population, more electoral votes. He gets a larger percentage of the vote, although if the Democrats had stayed united, he would have lost. So between the time of his election and inauguration in March of 1861, 7 states secede. The Confederate position assumes that America is a compact of states. Each state individually agreed to allow the national government to act as its agent without relinquishing fundamental sovereignty. Any state at any time could withdraw from the compact. Most Northerners, including Lincoln, saw the Union as permanent, a more perfect Union, right? That's the saying. And Lincoln said, wait a second, all of you signed the Constitution. Nowhere does it say, if you don't like it, you can get the heck out of Dodge. So Lincoln denied that states ever possessed independent sovereignty as colonies and territories. He claimed that states accepted unconditionally the sovereignty of the national government with the ratification of the Constitution. We have a question? Oh no, I thought I heard something, sorry. Lincoln said the right of revolution is not a legal right, but a moral right that depends upon the suppression of liberties and freedoms for it to be justified. He's saying to the South, what rights have we kept from you? What freedoms are being trampled by my election? The South still enjoyed the constitutional freedom they always enjoyed to exercise revolution. And he calls it revolution because the South is saying this is the second American Revolution, the Civil War, or secession. Lincoln says to exercise revolution with no moral cause to justify it is, quote, simply a wicked exercise of physical power, unquote. Most Northerners agree with him, which is why Lincoln says when the war starts, this is about the Union. It's not about slavery, because again, he's terrified, not terrified, but he knows if he says, hey, this is about slavery and abolition, are people from Philadelphia going to support him the way that they would if he says, this is about the Union? Much more patriotic, much more, concrete to say that the Union is in trouble. So Lincoln prepares his inaugural with an eye to keeping the Upper South or the border states from joining the Confederacy. He reaffirms his promise not to interfere with slavery where it existed. However, he makes clear that he would, quote, hold, occupy, and possess property in places belonging to the government. He says to the Confederacy, no state can leave the Union, quote, upon its own mere motion, unquote. And I think that should be notion, pardon me. And he pledges to enforce all the laws. He ends with, quote, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not mine, is the momentous issue of civil war, unquote. So he's basically laying it at their feet. The way that the war starts, the attack on Fort Sumter, there's a debate. Lincoln's cabinet and Lincoln saying, do I resupply the fort? Do I not resupply the fort? Lincoln says, we're going to resupply it, but all we're going to send down are food, clothing, non-military items. Well, it's during the resupply that the fort's attacked. So Lincoln can say, I didn't start this war. Jefferson Davis and the South did. Again, just thinking ahead politically, and also think about how he's selling the war to the North. We have been attacked. The Union is in danger. Much easier to get support for that than saying, we have been attacked, we're going to end slavery. Okay? So Lincoln repeatedly says, I want to save the Union. What does the South say? This is about states' rights. Well, what's the states' right that they're trying to defend? Slavery. Okay? And again, it goes back to nullification, where Lincoln says the only way. So when the war starts, let me step back. When the war starts, Lincoln says, if I could free all the slaves and keep the Union together, I'd do it. If I could free none of the slaves and keep the Union together, I would do it. If I only freed half of the slaves and it kept the Union together, I would do it. So Lincoln his ultimate goal is to keep the Union intact. And he is saying to the South, if you stay in the family, we're not going to mess with slavery. We're going to let it, because their thought ultimately was that it was going to die out. Again, with industrialization and mechanization and all those sorts of things. So Lincoln is ultimately concerned that once secession starts, that Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, the border states, are going to join the Confederacy. So that's why once the war starts, he continues to say, this is about Union. All I'm looking to do is keep slavery where it is. I'm not going to mess with it where it already exists. July of 1862, Lincoln announces to his cabinet the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation. Think of where we are in the war in 1862. Things are not going real well for the Union. The biggest highlight is the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862, where Grant wins one of the first major battles of the war. However, because of all the casualties, Grant's called a butcher, he's called a drunk, he's those sorts of things. Lincoln's response to when those who did not like Grant would say to Lincoln, hey, he's drinking again. Lincoln's response was, find out what whiskey he's drinking, because I want to send it to all my other generals, because maybe they'll fight like Grant does. So Lincoln looked past all of that. Lincoln and Grant had a phenomenal relationship. I'll mention some other books at the end of the talk, but there's a great book. It's now a couple of years old. It's by Ron Chernow. It's a biography of Grant. Absolutely phenomenal. Chernow, who wrote Alexander Hamilton, right? I don't think there's going to be a play on U.S. Grant, but it is a great book. Lincoln, Grant, and Sherman are on the same page during the war. We have to crush the Confederacy. We have to end slavery. And then we have to work for, working for getting rid of slavery via amendments. As Grant is climbing the ladder and succeeding in the war, Lincoln is concerned as they approach the 1864 election that Grant is going to run for office. Grant says to Lincoln, I have a big enough job on my hands. I want no part of this. And Lincoln says, great, and then can focus on that. But to step back to the Emancipation Proclamation, July of 62, things are not going well for the Union. William Seward, who is Lincoln's Secretary of State, says, if you put this out now, it's going to be the last shriek of a dying Union. People aren't going to take it seriously because we aren't doing well in the war. You have to wait for a better moment. When does Lincoln announce it? The day after the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, mid-September 1862, technically a Union victory. McClellan could have ended the war because he found Lee's battle plans and for 18 hours did nothing, could have bagged Lee's army and basically ended it in 1862. Unfortunately, we still have 2.5 years of war being fought. So Lincoln issues the most revolutionary measure ever to come from a president up to that time. In his message to Congress in December of 1862, after the after the Democrats increased their strength in the congressional elections, he links emancipation to saving the Union. He says, quote, "In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth," unquote. Just Lincoln is just a fascinating guy. Great speaker. By the end of the war, more than 180,000 African Americans serve in the Union. Absolutely helps to win the war. Most were former slaves, about 150,000 who flocked to Union lines. Lincoln is worried that the Emancipation Proclamation might be nullified by the courts after the war on grounds that any confiscation of quote unquote property, so go back to the Fifth Amendment in the Bill of Rights, required due process of law, and that such a policy could only be adopted by a law passed by Congress. Lincoln uses his reelection in 1864 to promote a constitutional amendment that would end slavery everywhere in the United States. That's the 13th Amendment. The first 13th Amendment that was proposed as the war was starting was to leave slavery where it existed. It was a last-ditch hope in keeping the Union together. Of course, we now know what the 13th does. So Lincoln's second inaugural, which is just fascinating. It's the shortest inaugural in history, shortest inaugural address, 271 words. I'm going to read some of them because some of these lines we've heard before, especially if, like me, you've watched the Ken Burns series on the Civil War about 172 times and know it by heart. But just incredible. So Lincoln goes on to say, quote, "On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all saw averted. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war." Again, saving the Union. "Insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation." So Lincoln is blaming the South here for the war, as he should. He's saying it's their fault. We wanted to negotiate, but that hasn't happened here. He then goes on to talk about how 1/8 of the whole population of the South, and only the South, was made up of slaves, and how this peculiar institution was going to be saved, hopefully, by a win in the Civil War. So, two other things I want to read here, because again, Lincoln is just, he's an unbelievable writer, orator. And again, this goes back to Henry Clay, his hero, and Daniel Webster, another hero, who were great in their time at giving speeches. Think about it as well at that time, and maybe these are the halcyon days. You don't have 24/7 news. You don't have the internet. So how are people getting their news? They're reading newspapers. And people's speeches, what happened at that time is the Henry Clays of the world, the Abraham Lincolns of the world. What they would do is they would mail their speech after they had given it nationally. So people all over the country could read it and say, wow, I don't know who this guy is, but I buy into his message. So Lincoln goes on to say, and Lincoln wasn't very religious, but he brings up God in the speech. And it's just, again, it's just an interesting statement by Lincoln. So he goes on to say, quote, both, meaning the North and the South, read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, talking about slavery. But let us not judge not that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered, the North and the South. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. I mean, just unbelievable. Think of more recently, in our lifetimes, maybe even before our lifetimes, some of the more notable inaugural addresses. Now, granted, we're in the midst of a civil war, so this carries a lot more weight. But of course, ask not what you can do for your country, right? The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, FDR. There aren't a lot of notable lines, unless, of course, you're, an even bigger geek than me, and you can remember that. But, just Lincoln, just the prose, the words just flow from him. Last paragraph, quote, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to achieve and cherish a lasting peace among ourselves and with the world. So Lincoln here is talking about Reconstruction. The $1 million question is, would things have been different if Lincoln had lived? Perhaps. I know, it's not really a yes or a no. One of my favorite historians and writers, H.W. Brands, B-R-A-N-D-S, has written about 30 books on American history, all available at the Haverford Township Free Library. But he recently wrote a book about Lincoln and John Brown called The Zealot and the Emancipator. And during one of his talks, somebody said, hey, if Lincoln had lived, do you think he would be as revered as he is today? Of course, what he did during the Civil War and his assassination, make him the greatest president that has ever lived. But what Brand said is Lincoln would have had a really hard time getting his Reconstruction plans through Congress. And it may not have been any better than what we ended up enacting, which really would have been a hit on his legacy. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. I've got about 5 more minutes, and then we can open up for questions. So Lincoln, in closing, he was the most activist president in history. Of course, and FDR is a close second because of the Depression, because of World War II. But with Lincoln, of course, it's because of the Civil War. Lincoln completely transforms the president's role as commander-in-chief and chief executive into a powerful new position, making the president supreme over both Congress and the courts. Think about it. When Washington is president, he's concerned that every one of his actions is going to set precedent, right? So everything he does, well, great story about Washington. quickly, I can't avoid talking about him. I love the guy. Washington as president goes into the Senate to sit and watch them debate a treaty. Of course, Washington is intimidating the senators, so they're not getting a lot done. At the end of the day, Washington leaves upset and says, I'm never coming back into this Senate. And of course, the senators are wiping their brows saying, thank God, Washington is the last president to watch the Senate debate a treaty. Because, and it's just those sorts of things. But so you could say, arguably, before Lincoln, the most powerful president is Jackson, right? And then after Jackson, think of it, can you name any of the presidents after Jackson? Maybe, maybe not. And the big reason is Congress at the time takes some of that power back. The Henry Clays of the world, the John C. Calhouns of the world, the Daniel Websters of the world. Lincoln is arguably the most powerful, with FDR a close second, president. After Lincoln, what happens? Think about it. Congress again takes the power back, which is why people have a really difficult time. Yes, we know Andrew Johnson, and yes, we know U.S. Grant. But after that, it gets a little murky in presidential history. I don't know a lot of Rutherford B. Hayes fans. Guy was president, not trying to diss him, but the point being, Congress takes a lot of that power back until who comes along? Teddy Roosevelt. It seems the presidents we know the best tend to exert executive power the most, and also in the best way. Others have tried and failed, right? Nixon and whatnot. So what happens here is that with Lincoln's activism, it begins with Fort Sumter, the flag behind me, which is falling. I was talking about George Washington. There's a picture behind that flag, and George is trying to make an appearance. What happens after Fort Sumter? Lincoln calls out state militias. He increases the size of the Army and the Navy. He asks for, or actually he doesn't ask, he spends $2 million without congressional approval, or appropriation. $2 million today to Congress is like a quarter that you and I find in our couch. But at that time, it's a huge deal. He blockaded southern ports. He closed post offices. He suspends the writ of habeas corpus. So he takes some very powerful steps, breaks various laws and whatnot. But what he demonstrates as a president is that the president had a special duty that went beyond Congress and the courts, a duty that required constant executive action in times of crisis, while other branches of government are required to support the Constitution. Lincoln's actions pointed to the notion that the president alone is sworn to protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution. That's part of the oath, right? At the inauguration. In times of war, this makes the president responsible for the well-being and the survival of the nation. And that, I'm going to share a couple of books, and then we'll open it up to questions. Again, saying thank you so much to Haverford Township Library and to the Historical Society, to Mary and Kate for putting this together, and for all of you for being great listeners. A few books I want to share. April 1865 is the title of the book. By the author is J. Winnick, W-I-N-I-K. Great book about this month in 1865 and how important it is in the history of the nation. H.W. Brands, pardon me, I get choked up when I talk about it. B-R-A-N-D-S, has written numerous books. One of them, I mentioned, The Zealot and the Emancipator is his most recent book, but he also wrote a great book about Clay, Calhoun, Webster, and Jackson called Heirs to the Founders. And it covers that area from about the War of 1812 to 1850. Just a fascinating read. The biography of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass didn't think that Lincoln did enough. Frederick Douglass, when Lincoln was talking about colonization, which was a big movement, saying, hey, we'll just send all the slaves back to Liberia, we'll send them to Haiti, we'll send them to South America. Frederick Douglass, his quote about Lincoln at that point, Abraham Lincoln is a first-rate, second-rate man, unquote. Douglass is the guy chirping in Lincoln's ear saying, arm the freed slaves, put them in the Union Army. The psychological effect on the South will be tremendous, as well as you'll have more than 100,000 soldiers to help you fight. These guys want to fight and die for the freedom of others. I'm looking at my list. The Fiery Trial by Eric Foner, F-O-N-E-R, won the Pulitzer Prize about 6 or 7 years ago. It talks about Lincoln and his struggle with slavery. And the book I mentioned on Douglass also won the Pulitzer Prize. It's a healthy 750 pages, so you really have to devote a lot of time. But it's dense, but it's a really good read. So I'm going to end there, open it up for questions. You can unmute yourselves, ask away. But again, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you got something out of this, and you can tell by my being lathered up, I really enjoy talking about this stuff.
My question, can you hear me? Okay.
Absolutely.
Why did Lincoln suspend habeas corpus?
So Lincoln, what he did is it kind of was a ripple effect. He did several things. Any press that wrote badly about him, he shut down the newspaper. And he threw editors in jail. Now, of course, today, you read some newspapers and you say, hey, maybe that's not a bad idea, facetiously. But you also had people all along the spectrum who were against the war on the one end, who were more Southern sympathizers in the North. And then you also had the radical Republicans who thought that Lincoln wasn't doing enough, who, when the war started, said, this is not for Union, this is to end slavery. So the reason he suspends the writ of habeas corpus is he wants to ensure, and it sounds horrible, but that the troublemakers, those working against him and against the Union cause, are silenced immediately. There was one congressman, his last name is Vallandigham. He was known as a copperhead radical Republican senator from Ohio. He is, popping off from the cheap seats, at least in Lincoln's mind. And Lincoln has him basically thrown out of the Union, says, hey, you know what? Thanks, but no thanks, and gets rid of him. And again, if that happened today, now seeing our Congress and our Senate, maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea if we did that here and there, jokingly, but no, it's those sorts of things. So Lincoln takes some very extra legal and illegal steps, but in his mind, it all falls under the war powers. It would be similar to, and it's a really good question. It'd be similar to, think of FDR and his executive order to open up the detainment camps in World War II. And maybe it's a stretch, but think of after 9/11, think of some of the stuff that this country did, the Patriot Act and those sorts of things. And Lincoln funnels it into, hey, I'm doing this all for the Union. And of course, there are people who say, well, it's kind of some thin ice that you're treading on.
Got it. Thanks.
Sure.
I have a question too.
Sure.
So how much states were there when Lincoln was in office, and how much states were there when Lincoln was done or assassinated?
This flag behind me has, and it's hard to tell because it's crinkled a little bit. So this was flying at Fort Sumter when it was attacked. There are 29 stars here on the flag. And at the time, there were a couple more free states than there were slave states. And that's why the South was looking at secession because as we're spreading westward, more territory is falling under the free state or, anti-slavery banner, and the South was getting very upset. How many there are when we're finished? That's a really good question. I don't know that, and I don't want to give you the wrong answer. But if someone listening wants to look it up on Google real fast, you'll get a gold star. But thank you for the question, and thanks for tuning in.
So just a kind of almost a follow-up to that. So the Union Army, how many stars were on their flag? Did they subtract the southern states from the flag during the war?
So this is what they carried. So they still considered the South part. And the other really cool thing, so thank God my wife is upstairs and not taking part in this, but one of my obsessions is I have various flags. I probably have about 24 flags throughout, the country's growth. And the point of my rambling is you had units that would carry their own flags. So a Pennsylvania regiment would carry, rather than carrying the state flag or the US flag, they would carry their own unit's flag. Think of the Fighting Irish out of New York City, right? The 69th Battalion, I believe it is. So you saw a lot of that. And the reason they did that is it really built an esprit de corps, because so many, and this is what hurts the South in the war, and it hurts, some Northern regiments as well, is if you get stuck in a really bad situation, think of, Pickett's Charge, or think of Gettysburg, think of Shiloh, think of any of the big battles. You could have a whole town's population of young men wiped out in a battle because they all served together under the same flag, same regiment, that sort of thing. So what would happen is when the Union took over a specific area, so when Benjamin Butler, Union general, takes over New Orleans, he flies the American flag from City Hall, which completely annoys the Southern population there, right? But many carried the US flag, but many also carried their own very specific battle flag. And if you want a really interesting thing, is there are several museums online. If you type in Civil War battle flags, you will see the actual flag of a specific regiment with bullet holes. It's torn, it's this, it's that. Really interesting stuff. Good question, though. Thank you.
I sort of have an answer for your state thing, but
Nice.
So according to this list, by January 1861, there were 34. And then, so Kansas was joined in 1861, then West Virginia in 1863, Nevada in 1864. So there were 36 by the end of the Civil War.
Thank you, Kate. You get the gold star.
Questions for Jim?
So I don't think the chat is enabled. So if anyone's trying to write.
Good evening.
Hi.
Oh, this is really an informative discussion and insightful. Thank
you
for sharing. Could
Oh,
you
my pleasure.
some insight into the act that compensated slave owners for their lost property versus the land grants that were discussed, but and Sojourner Truth was an advocate for the land grants for the slaves, especially those that fought. Any insight in that area of?
Absolutely. So early in the, and this is something that Henry Clay actually comes up with. Henry Clay is the founder of the American Colonization Society in 1819, which is talking about sending slaves and freedmen, out of the country. And of course, you have freedmen in northern states whose family or who they themselves fought in the Revolution, who are saying, there's no way I'm leaving the country. Why would I want to leave the country? So as part of the colonization, they talk about paying a certain amount of money per slave. And of course, Southerners are saying, wait a second, if I paid $1,000 for my slave and you're only paying me 500, that doesn't do me any good. And the other problem that Lincoln ran into with that, there were several, but one was Congress said, why are we paying these guys? You know, we're looking at ultimate, and the radical Republicans especially saying, we're going to pay for this? Absolutely, absolutely not. So it was an idea that was floated. It was discussed. There was also within Lincoln's cabinet, Seward and Chase tended to be more of the radical Republicans saying, hey, we have to get rid of slavery altogether. Whereas you had others, Stanton, who was not quite as vehement, and Bates, who was his attorney general from Missouri, I believe, who said, hey, you know what, this, you know, paying some sort of compensation is a good idea, but it would have been sticky, the details. As far as, and I'm glad you brought up Sojourner Truth. There's a great picture. She actually meets Lincoln in the White House. And think about it, at the time, Frederick Douglass also made several visits to the White House, and Douglass had a tough time getting past security because they said, there's no way we're going to let you through. And he would write a note to Lincoln, and Lincoln would come out and say, my friend, Frederick Douglass, you're here. And of course, security was like, oh my gosh, that's a huge deal. But Sojourner Truth also met Lincoln in the White House. What Lincoln had looked to do, and this was part of the Reconstruction policy, is initially not only part of the homestead, but what Congress tried to do is they said, okay, Jim Daly has a plantation in Atlanta, and there are 10 slaves who worked it. Well, we're going to divide that into plots, and those 10 slaves each have an equal plot. And I'm really dumbing this down. I mean, it wasn't that simple. But initially, after the war, that was done. But as more states, Southern states, came back into the Union, Lincoln initially, as part of Reconstruction, said, I only want 10% of a state's, Southern state's male population to swear an oath to the Union. And we're going to let them back in. Radical Republicans said, absolutely not. It's got to be 50%. And again, they're looking to hurt the South more than Lincoln, who's saying, these are our countrymen. We have to bring them back in. But the point of that being, the more strident that the radical Republicans and North were towards the South, when those states came back in, the Southern states, what they did is, if my plantation had been divided up amongst 10 slaves, they basically said, hey, Jim, here's your land, here's your plantation, you can have it back. And those slaves were frozen out. And what would happen is, you know, we've heard the term sharecropping. Well, it basically put slaves in debt in perpetuity, because I would charge you a rent to work my land, and the rent was more than what the proceeds of the harvest would be. And it was hard for a slave. Of course, there's a great migration after the war of African Americans to the North, right? To Philly and Detroit and Boston and on and on and on. Those were those slaves that were able to become part of the migration, because so many were basically drowning in debt from these sharecropper agreements. Many of them end up staying. And of course, then you have Jim Crow laws, and the KKK comes into play, and all those sorts of things. So very good question, though. Thanks for asking.
More questions for Jim? No? Okay, well. Oh, and I just enabled chat. So if you're shy, you can just put your question in the
Type
chat.
something in.
I'm sorry. I don't know why it wasn't enabled, so I apologize. So, wow. Well, I feel much smarter now. So thank you.
Oh no, my pleasure.
Jim, you can also, so you're gonna do your history for shut-ins. What other, are you gonna be teaching any classes this spring or in the fall?
I
that you
am.
can-
So I've
Okay.
taught a class, I've taught 2 classes already. One on the time period between World War I and World War II in Europe. I just taught a class on Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun, called the Great Triumvirate. That's what they were called. And I have a class starting next week at Grange Park in Havertown, live and in person. I reserved the pavilion for 5 weeks. I'm giving a class on the generals who served under Washington in the Revolutionary War.
Okay, well, so there's lots to choose from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will post any talks and share with you and Kate any upcoming talks that I have. Nothing's been finalized, but I have a few things in the works.
Well, the other good news is that I did record tonight, so I am actually gonna put this on. This will end up on YouTube, and then I will post it to hopefully the front page of the Haverford Township Free Library website. I can also share that link with Kate if she wants to put it on her on the Historical Society website. So if there's anybody that you think would have really enjoyed tonight, you can share with them the recording. So anyway, I think that's it. Thank you everybody for coming tonight. We
Thanks
really
all.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very
Um,
much.
Thank you.
We hope to continue to partner
you.
with the Historical Society in the fall. So be on the lookout for something coming up then. So everyone have a great night.
Take care
Thank
all.
you.
Stay well.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.